And lunch will take place after we finish. So looking forward to that. Chapter 20, obviously, is resurrection. So we've had the crucifixion, we've had the burial, so we're heading towards resurrection. Again, Jack was supposed to be the one doing this, so fortunate thing was I taught this just end of June at Livingston, this particular chapter. So this is basically what I taught them. So there you go. Again, as we emphasized there, the entire gospel has been moving towards that point in time, the crucifixion. We saw in the earlier chapters it wasn't his time yet. We approached the day of crucifixion. It was the time has arrived. And then the very end of John chapter 19, his final words, it is finished. It's completed. It's accomplished. Or as Tom Wright put it, it's done. This is it. With his death, Jesus did what he came to do. To live as a human, to experience everything in life that we go through, but living a sinless life, and then dying for our sin. But of course, the story isn't over yet. There's still 2 more chapters, so it's not over yet. He's accomplished, but there's other things that need to take place. Merrill Tenney had this to say. He said the 20th chapter of John is the climax of the book. The tragedy of unbelief, which culminated in the cross, would remain forever unresolved were there no resurrection. For evil would have triumphed over good, and the heroic and vicarious death of Jesus would be at least a magnificent but futile gesture. Yeah, the resurrection's important. How many people died by crucifixion? And yet it was just a death. I mean, there's the chap's ankle bone that we have there in the Israel Museum. But this one was important, and it's important because of chapter 20. We take a little slight diversion. I did this for Livingston because they asked the question. So there's always a question, what day all this stuff happened? You know, what's your timeline here? Traditionally, Jesus' Last Supper was on a Thursday night, crucified on Friday. Although, when you think about it, for the Jews, those were both Friday, okay? Because of when the day began. I think this is part of our problem in all this, is we think Western, and we're not putting ourselves back into the time period, and resurrected on Sunday. And by the way, that sort of scenario seems to be supported somewhat from the Synoptic Gospels. But it leaves unanswered why John referred to the day of crucifixion as the day of preparation for the Passover. So others have had problems with this in justifying Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days. So some have suggested rather than the traditional Friday crucifixion, there'd be a Thursday crucifixion, because that was the preparation day with Passover beginning on the Friday evening, or the Thursday evening, which was actually Friday there. And so the Last Supper would have been on a Wednesday evening as we reckon time. Okay, this is as we reckon time. The crucifixion would have been on Thursday when the lambs were killed. I think that makes such good sense. And the resurrection, Sunday, of course, and there's good support from John's Gospel. But as I mentioned, others have problems with this because they can't justify in their minds, at least, Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days. So some have suggested this, and I don't really go along with this, but I've heard it, that the crucifixion was actually on Tuesday, as we'd reckon time, with the Last Supper on Tuesday, crucifixion on Wednesday, in our time reckoning, and the resurrection on Sunday, because that gives you 3 days and 3 nights. Actually, it gives you 4 days. Yeah, it actually does not solve the problem. Alistair, by the way, took that view. And I thought, this isn't logical. Because by trying to get 3 and 3, you end up with 4 and 3. Because that's the way it's going to work out.
So it's the cloak. the day, you're still midnight. No, you're still this midnight.
Yeah.
Changing the day, they're changing it.
I think that's half our problem in thinking through it. I really do think it is. So anyway.
John, can I say something?
Yes, you can.
It's nothing to do with anything.
Oh, go ahead.
Other than just when you mentioned Alistair.
Yeah.
I was dreaming about him last night.
Oh, really? Wow.
And, it just came back to me. He was singing, Linda wasn't there. It was just Alistair leading the song, Without Him I Would Be Nothing.
I was just thinking of that song. He would love that
And
song.
What song was it?
Without Him I Would Be Nothing.
Oh, yeah.
And he was lying sat in his chair and there was tears in his eyes.
Yeah.
And that was it. That was
Oh,
it.
wow. Wow. Interesting. You mentioned Alistair singing. The one thing that always comes into my mind is Munch Navel Do.
Yeah. I remember that one.
And it was a song that we did with the children, but we did it in several languages. Yeah. Munch Navel Do, Munch Navel Do. Yeah. So. Yeah.
To get us back to this.
Yes.
With the traditional synoptic gospel, and do they mention, obviously John's gospel says day of preparation. Do they mention this happened on this day or whatever?
I'm not sure. I had to go back and revisit it. I've not revisited. I've been looking at John on this one, so I'm just not sure. Go back and have a look at it because it's well worth it. But they all, by the way, have some logic to them because they're trying to make it fit something. But the spanner of the works for me comes from John's gospel mentioning that he was crucified on the day of preparation of Passover, the Sabbath being a high Sabbath or a special Sabbath. 1828, you see something in there. What exactly is meant by that? Well, the Sabbath, there's two views on it. Some that the Sabbath and the day of convocation coincided on the same Sabbath day, making that Sabbath doubly important. Could be. The Sabbath and day of convocation were usually on consecutive days, which would seem to give credence to the Thursday crucifixion, which also allows for 3 days and 3 nights using Jewish timekeeping without any problem whatsoever. But my conclusions is I tend to go for the middle one. I don't think any of them are 100% conclusive, but really based on John's gospel combined with the Old Testament details as to the Passover. To me, that makes good sense. One final point. I made this on the shape of the cross. Does it really matter? No. I like historical things. I like timelines. I like all that. So yeah, I like to investigate it. But does it really matter? To be honest, the important part is that Jesus died. And he died for us. And that we are to remember it not as an annual event, so therefore the day of the week doesn't come into play. We remember it when we remember the resurrection, which is every Sunday. That's something, this annual event was brought in much later than this. The New Testament does tell us to remember the death and resurrection through the Lord's Supper. In fact, Jesus basically said that himself. We saw that we didn't see that last time because John doesn't record that part. But in the New Testament does tell us what day he arose. I think that's the important part then, because that's the one that we're told. And we can see from the book of Acts, that's when Christians got together to break bread. Possibly the New Testament is a bit non-conclusive as to the exact date of his death, because that's not important for us to know. What we need to know is he died on the cross. He was crucified for us. That's what's important. David Roper did some writing on this in the Truth for Today commentary. And he said, the conclusion we reach on this question is not a matter of faith. As long as we agree that Jesus arose on the first day, we can disagree regarding the day on which he died without that disagreement affecting our fellowship. Primarily, the question has to do with how we arrange the events in the last week of Jesus' public ministry. It's a historical question, not a scriptural question. And I like the history, as you know, so that sort of does things there. Andrew Patterson wrote, Everything about the Christian faith stands or falls upon the truth or otherwise of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There could be nothing more serious or life-changing than the question as to whether Jesus Christ is really alive. Of all the signs recorded throughout this gospel, none is greater than this. This is it. This is it. You know, the Bible is silent as to what the apostles and others were doing between the crucifixion and the first day of the week. I mean, we just don't know. It's quiet. I have a feeling they were in mourning. You know, if you think about it, Passover was a celebration. I don't think they're celebrating. They may not, of course, they've had the meal with Jesus, but that's about all they did for it. Donald Guthrie said the day after the death of Jesus was the most depressing Sabbath that the disciples had ever known. They were utterly bewildered and disillusioned. Their hopes of a messianic kingdom were dashed. Their king had been crucified in shame. Nothing seemed to be left. Against this background of deep discouragement, the momentous event of the resurrection of Jesus must be considered. So the next incident that takes place is when the Sabbath was over. Now, the Sabbath would have ended at 6 p.m. on Saturday. And those of us who've been there, been to Israel, are well aware when Shabbat's over and the elevators work, the lifts work right. Yeah. So, so it's over. What's that? Yes. There's so much you can't get in the hotels. So it ended on 6 p.m. on Saturday, and the women purchased spices and prepared them to use on Jesus' body. Go ahead.
Do you not think that fear would have been a significant
Oh, absolutely.
factor in this? I mean, they were certainly, the hopes were dashed and all this, but their leader, their teacher, has not only been arrested, he's been executed, and they must have feared that the authorities would come for them next.
Were they next?
With the same end.
Yeah. With the same end, yeah. Keeping in mind.
You'd be hiding away, not really
Yeah.
celebrating.
Yeah. But they're behind locked doors when we see them in Luke's account. But keeping in mind as well, when Jesus was taken, they were with him.
Yeah.
They've been identified. They know who his disciples are. So, yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's definitely fear going on in their minds at this point as well. But it's the women, isn't it? It's the women who venture out. Next morning, it says just before dawn, so we know we are in our timekeeping, first day of the week. Jewish timekeeping, first day of the week. So it doesn't matter which timekeeping, it's the first day of the week. Just before dawn, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, so I'm assuming that's Mary, the mother of James, wife of Clopas. Salome, she's there too. Mentions another lady here, Joanna, and a few more. The rest of the women. We don't know who all those were. So there's a whole group of them on the way to the tomb. John, by the way, only mentions Mary. Go ahead.
Is that because women were the ones that prepared the
Yeah.
spices? Or was it, but then when you see that Nicodemus brought the spices.
There you go. Yeah.
So
So he's done the initial embalming, but it is something that the tender care of a body, and they've not had time to do it.
I was hurried.
It was so hurried, they've not been allowed in. So these are the close ones. His aunt's there, if we got this right. Mary Magdalene, very close. So yeah, these are the ones who cared for him. I think they want to do their bit, in their minds, their last bit for him. I think that's what's going on there. John only mentions Mary Magdalene by name, but it would seem that they were all there, as she uses in verse 2, we, plural. That it's more than her, even though John only, because John's centering on what happens with her, not on what happens with the rest. Again, the other accounts dealt with them. John's going to deal with something they didn't deal with. When the women arrived at the tomb, they saw that the stone was rolled away. It's the tomb's open. It's gone. By the way, I always found this bizarre. The first time, especially driving up in Galilee. This is a reconstructed tomb in Nazareth village, but driving along up there in Galilee, suddenly they're on the side of the road. When they were building the road, they found first century tombs. And I think every time I try to get a good picture of it, I think that's the best I've come up with yet so far. But you're just driving along and there's these tombs. Wow. So, by the way, tombs in Israel, and I think that this really well illustrates it, usually had a circular stone. It was set in a groove which rolled down by its own weight, so on an incline to seal the tomb. By the way, for it to be opened, big stone, rolling it uphill, that would have been a bit difficult. By the way, to talk about the garden tomb we did earlier, there is a groove there, by the way. It turns out it was chiseled by 1800 soldiers, and they filled it with water so the donkeys could drink out of it. So it's a trough rather than a groove. So there you go. There you go.
Soldiers from the 1800s or 1800s.
Yes, indeed, both. I like it. Yes. So they see the stones rolled away, but you notice, and this is the point that Merrill Tenney makes, John doesn't say directly how the stone was moved. He doesn't. But he left the impression in the mind of the reader that it was done by divine intervention. I think he's right there. So, by the way, I don't think Jesus had to move the stone to get out. Okay? I don't think that happened at all. But it has been rolled away so that they can see that the tomb is empty. So I think there is divine intervention there. It would seem that when Mary Magdalene saw the stone rolled away, she immediately took off to go tell the apostles. This is momentous. Something's happened. You need to check it out. Tom Wright said this: Mary Magdalene doesn't feature in John's gospel until her appearance with the other Marys at the foot of the cross. John has told us nothing of her history. The little we know from the other gospels. But her place here is spectacular. She's the first to bring the news that the tomb was empty. And in the next section, a greater privilege yet, the first to see, to meet, to speak with the risen Master himself. That's what's going on. Patterson writes, if the resurrection were a hoax constructed for some reason by the apostles, they would most definitely not have had as their primary eyewitness a woman. I mean, that would not have been done in the first century. Instead, they'd have chosen a respected male member of the community, for a woman's evidence, according to the Mishnah, was not normally admissible in court. But her presence here strongly underlines that John was recording what actually took place. So this goes against the social norms of first century. Mary Magdalene found Peter and John there together and informed them that they've taken the Lord from the tomb. We don't know where they've put him. Now, she's left. The other synoptic accounts tell us that there were angels and had told the other women. She seems to have missed that. And she's headed straight back. And she's assumed from the stone being rolled away that the body's gone, or perhaps she could see from the outside that there's no body inside. Again, doesn't mention that all the apostles are there. It's just Peter and John. So it almost seems like, and possibly is, that Peter is staying somewhat apart at this stage from the other apostles. Possibly because he denied Jesus 3 times. That seems to have weighed on him. But we find John with him, so perhaps John had gone to help him. But they immediately get up and run for the tomb. Apparently with Mary Magdalene following a bit slower behind. Patterson wrote, they were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. That always blows my mind. Because how many times has he said it? And I think I heard somebody, I read something once. Do you think Jesus was disappointed when he resurrects and nobody's there after saying it so many times? But anyway, they were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. That was far from their thoughts. Despite all the things he had told them, they were not expecting that miraculous event. So off they ran to the tomb, the younger John outpacing older Peter. And it does seem that John was a bit younger, and he's a lot faster. So he gets there first. John arrives, looks in, saw the grave close, but doesn't enter. John 20 records that he bent down to look in. By the entrances to most of the ones you saw there on the side of the road there, and even the one in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's only about 3 foot high. You've got to stoop down to get in. You don't need to chisel out a huge, you're sticking a body in it. So we don't need a huge area there. Peter then arrived and entered, seeing the grave clothes lying as if the body had simply come out through them. I believe Mel Gibson did that well in Passion of the Christ. That it just, there's the body wrapped, then suddenly it just goes shoop. And I think that's the idea. It's as if it's still wrapped, but the body's come out. They've not unwrapped the body. That's the point. And the cloth that had been on his head is folded and lying by itself. I guess you'd have to take that part off. But so all that's what they see. Wiersbe says, in fact, with the presence of the spices in the folds of the clothes, it would have been almost impossible to unwrap a corpse without damaging the wrappings. The only way those linen cloths could be left in that condition would be if Jesus passed through them as he arose from the dead. That's what he did.
Well, you think that's 80 pounds of spices?
Yeah, just pass through. Yeah, so, yeah. And by the way, that tells us he don't need to move the stone to get out. He'd pass through that too, as he does it. Well, we'll get that in chapter 21. No, we'll get that later on in just a few minutes. Tom Wright says, it looks as though the body wasn't picked up and unwrapped, but had just disappeared, leaving the empty cloths like a collapsed balloon when the air has gone out of it. The archaeologists have found at least one first-century tomb just south of where Jesus' tomb must have been, with grave cloths just like this surrounding what's left of the bones. The body must have been buried just before the devastating Jewish-Roman War of AD 66 to 70, and the secondary burial of the bones never took place. So we actually have a first-century grave where they've not gone back and gotten the bones and put them in the ossuary because they apparently didn't have time because of the war that went on. John then enters after Peter enters. And the text there says he saw and believed. So John, by the way, uses 3 different words for seeing in verse 5, 6, and 8. Verse 5, he glances in. Verse 6, Peter observes carefully. And verse 8, John perceives with intelligent comprehension. He understands. And, we use see in English in all those ways as well. Why did the grave clothes cause John to believe? I think in a nutshell, it gave evidence that he'd come back to life, that his body hadn't been stolen. If friends had moved Jesus' body, they would not have taken the grave clothes. Or they would not have left the grave clothes. They'd taken everything, just up and got it. If enemies had stolen the body, again, they would not have unwrapped it, nor taken the time to fold the wrappings neatly in the cloth covering its head, all that. They would have done that. The only logical explanation, I think that's where John is that Jesus had left the grave wrappings. He had in some way come through them, and he must now be alive. Tenney says the tomb had not been opened to let Jesus out, but to let in the disciples. Transformed by the resurrection, he had passed through the grave clothes, leaving like an outworn chrysalis the cerements of the tomb for the vestments of glory. He had a way with words, didn't he? But it makes a good point there. Neither Peter nor John yet understood that the scriptures had prophesied that the Messiah would be raised from the dead. They then returned to their homes. John's believing to some extent. Peter, though, is wondering what's happened. We saw that in our class on Wednesday, that he's up on the roof. He sits there after that vision, wondering, pondering it, thinking about it. I think we see that this seems to be a characteristic of Peter, doesn't it? If something happens, he sits and reasons through it. But back to Mary. Mary shows up. It seems like she's a little ways behind them because they seem to have come, looked, and left, and then she arrives. And she probably expected maybe to see the women, maybe to see Peter and John, but they've all left. So she's standing outside the tomb. She's crying. And keep in mind, she believes at this stage Jesus' body had been stolen. She looks this time inside the tomb. And she saw two angels. One sitting where the head would have been. One sitting where the feet of Jesus' body would have been. They asked why she was crying. And she says, "They've taken away my Lord. I don't know where they've put him." And she then turned around. She saw Jesus. She doesn't realize it was Jesus. Possibly she saw or she sensed someone behind her. You know how that is? You're standing and suddenly you feel that there's somebody back there. Maybe it's something like that. She doesn't continue this conversation with the angels, nor are they mentioned again. But she turns around, she sees a figure. Why did she not recognize Jesus? Very possibly because she didn't expect to see him there. And I've had that happen to me. I was married, been married a couple years, knew Arlene's family well. We had a gospel meeting in 1983, the summer we worked here at Castle Milk, and a group from East Kilbride arrived. I saw people come in. I think I was leading singing that night. Saw people come into the back. Saw people I recognized. One of them was my sister-in-law, and I did not recognize her because she's just part of this group I thought I knew, but I did not recognize it was Louise. So, I've been there. I have seen somebody, and I knew her, but I've seen somebody I didn't recognize. That's my sister-in-law. I knew her quite well by that point. That's my sister-in-law.
That happened to me this year trying to walk by your sister. I said, I know that woman. There you go. Yeah, the female John, indeed. But it could be. Guthrie suggests she didn't recognize him because she's crying and you can't see clearly. And that could be something there. And some have also suggested that maybe Jesus kept his identity from her, although there's really no indication of that in the text. But others have just suggested maybe there's some changes in his resurrection body. Number one, it wouldn't be as crippled as it had been when they put him in. So maybe there. But I think putting verses 14 and 16 together, it would seem that she initially glanced at him and turned away. And then in verse 16, turns towards it and gazes at him, looks at him, fixes her eyes on him. And You don't believe he still wore some of the marks of the crucifixion?
No, he has marks, but I do believe he's also clothed. So she's not going to see that. She's not going to see that.
It's like the flogging and stuff. I think his bodies would have been more healed, but
Yeah.
he still has the marks.
And I don't think, because there would have been blood on his face when he's crucified. I don't think that's there anymore.
Swelling and
Yeah.
all sorts.
See, I sort of get the idea that when he sort of came out of the grave clothes, that he left all the mark. Of course, they've already prepared his body somewhat, so they've taken care of some of that, if not all of it, before they put him in.
So Jesus asks, why are you crying? Who are you looking for? Great. Mary thought Jesus was the gardener and asked him to tell her if he'd moved the body. And if he would take her to where the body was so she could take it away. I don't know how she's going to manage to carry that, but anyway, so she could take it away. And Jesus then said to her, Mary. Can you imagine if she thinks it's the gardener and he calls her by first name? Mary. And then she recognized who it was. That did it. Probably something she's heard a lot. And she replies in Aramaic, Rabboni, means teacher. So we know she knows who it is. Thomas Hale wrote, Mary had been hoping only to find Jesus' dead body. Instead, she found his living body. Yeah, it wasn't what she was expecting in any way, shape, or form. Jesus then told her not to cling to him, for she had not yet ascended to the Father, but she should go and tell my brothers that I ascend to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. That's an age-old, unresolved question. Why did Jesus tell Mary Magdalene not to hold on to him, yet allowed very, very soon after that women to hold on to him? Because he's going to appear to the women as they're heading back. So, why can Mary not? Here's Tom Wright's explanation. I thought it was okay. I think it's more likely that it was a warning to Mary that the new relationship with him was not going to be like the old one. He wouldn't be going around Galilee and Judea anymore, walking the lanes with him, sharing regular meals, discussing, talking, praying. They would see him now and then, but soon it would be time for him to go to the Father, as he had said over and over in chapters 14 to 17. That's why I think "don't cling to me" is the best way of saying what he said here. Don't try to keep me, to possess me. Strange words for a strange moment. I think that's as good an explanation as any. I've read others that are interesting. So the problem is it's not explained to us. It's not explained. But I sort of have in the back of my mind that he's not yet popped back up to see the Father, and he's to do that before he comes back. But because he's going to, and the only way I know to express it, he pops in and out quite a bit after this. Because where do you think he was during that 40 days? Was he living somewhere? I don't think so. I think it's popping back up and popping back down and popping back up, and I think it was just in and out until the resurrection, the ascension. The ascension wasn't for him to go anywhere, because rising into the sky is not going to send you back to God, but just to the finality for the apostles. That's it. I'm not going to be back until it's time. So that's my take on it, for what it's worth.
I can agree. I know where you're coming from that, but the only thing is that when he greets them out on the shore and has a meal with them, the idea is still that he's physical, because
he's physical.
You know what I mean? So,
he's physical, but he's different, as we're about to see.
Where did he get his clothes from?
Now that's the question, is it not?
Well, it's a question, but I mean, it's that he leaves us in the grave clothes, huh?
Anything's possible with God.
Oh no, I know, of course.
I like it, Gina.
No, it's not. No, I mean, the thing is that
It's a good point.
Maybe he borrowed them from another.
No, I mean, the thing that you speculate about the state of his body and popping up and down. I mean, it's rather, a fascinating idea, sort of put there.
I never thought about him popping up and down.
No,
Well, it's not an up and down per se. It is going back to the Father. I think he was staying with the Father rather than here. Yeah.
All of that is thinking in purely physical terms.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's clear, and so that's what I'm saying about his clothing, that it was just there. I mean, it's just, it was...
Bewitched.
well, it could have been.
It wasn't from anywhere. I mean,
No. It's just on him.
Maybe Nicodemus left him clothes there because he knew he was going to rise.
Maybe that's what he did.
Yeah. I get the impression that he was because Nicodemus wasn't there, but anyway.
I put a spare pair wear socks every 6 weeks or
Sandals,
When Jesus finished his fasting, it says that angels came and ministered to him.
What?
And I get the impression that that would have been with fruit juices or whatever, like to help him.
And a
with
fresh
his
pair of
hunger.
socks.
Quite possibly, but it could be the same thing here. We've got angels here, so.
Yeah, and very well could have been. Yeah, that's as good an answer as I've. I'll have to hang on to that one later.
But sorry, you were talking about it's physical, but no, the idea that we're thinking in purely physical terms, you said it, but really the introduction of the resurrection is about physical terms. It's the idea of overcoming death, his physical presence there, and then every other interaction is about his physicality.
Except when he's walking through doors.
Oh, I understand that.
Oh,
Oh,
Yes.
I know
The
that.
possibility,
But
the stone didn't have to be moved away, but
Yeah.
it was in order to make it clear. He could have just walked out.
Well, the pop-up thing then
I know.
comes in there, because when
That's what I'm
he
saying.
appears in the room,
Yeah.
what is the first thing he says to Thomas? No, Tom, it's almost like you can see him go, Thomas,
Yeah.
there's the physical evidence there.
Yeah.
Even though he's phantomized into that, you know what I mean, into that room, he's
Yeah.
just, you know what I mean?
I get the impression that
There is no limit. He's
Yeah.
not limited. to this physical.
yeah,
Not putting
no,
any limitation.
he's no limitation. I get the impression that when we see him, that there's way marks still.
Oh, aye.
Yeah, I don't think that's changed. That's the
What do you mean?
point.
Those are the marks that
What-
happen.
We die.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah,
I mean, when you say that Mary doesn't recognise him, I think he still bears the marks there. He might have been a cleaned up version, but he
Yeah.
bears the marks. Because that's the very things that Thomas asked for. Until I
Oh, yeah,
see those
the marks are there.
And they put
Yeah.
the hand on his side,
Yeah.
I will not believe. And that's the very thing. Christ just appears in the room and says, Thomas, and it's almost like that. And his response is, my Lord, my God, end of, done.
yeah,
Evidence is there.
done.
But that's physical.
Yeah. Billy.
He just appeared.
I was just thinking that sometimes to speculate it can be quite interesting. Other times it's absolutely pointless.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's no need. And I was thinking in terms of, you know, see how old the creation is. You know, millions of years for evolution and all that. We seem to get transfixed when we need to come up with an answer for that. We don't even need to ask the question. Because in the first instance, you know, in the very first day, in the beginning, you know, the earth could be millions and millions of years before that. So it's not a question we need to answer. Why do we insist on trying to answer things that they don't matter?
I would say
Yeah.
the difference is, those questions need to be answered to some degree because you're looking where you are from your faith standpoint. You're trying to get someone
Yeah.
to accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Saviour. So you need to convince them. So they're looking for answers. That's the difficulty.
Well.
I bought in, so I don't need the answers because I'm a believer. You know what I mean? But at one point in my life, I needed those answers.
Yeah. I think that's what I was going to say. That it's not for us, but when you have people, and I've talked to a lot of people that are banking on what took millions of years, the Bible has to be wrong. Then you need to have an answer for them to say, well, actually, the Bible's not wrong because science doesn't actually say that.
Yeah.
So,
But we need to come up with an answer where do these robes come from?
no. Good point. Good point.
I really don't care too much. But the point I was making was simply that there is more than simply the physical
Oh, yeah.
being.
So a lot going on there.
I'm sure he could turn his wounds on and off if he wanted. I mean, that's
If you
not.
walked up and down.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, keep it in mind, if he can heal somebody totally, then he could have dealt with that. Yeah.
At some point, Jesus say, I know yes, I know different.
Yeah.
Or you want whole
Yeah.
book there, you know.
So he's got to do that at some point. Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of good answers there. Yeah. In addressing Jesus, Guthrie writes, as Rabboni, teacher, she had not progressed beyond the former relationship with Jesus. He forestalled any attempt on her part to treat him in the same relationship by touching his body. Guthrie may have the right idea here. She had to learn that she could not retain him by physical means. And I thought that was a good explanation. McGarvey wrote that Jesus was simply telling her not to delay in relaying what she'd seen to the apostles. Don't grab hold of me. Go let him know. Go let him know. There's going to be other times with him later, and there would be. That's a possibility.
I get the
Yeah.
impression she was coming at him.
Yeah, I do as well. I do as well. So, so all that's going on there. But he permitted the rest to hold on to him for a while, which delayed them, allowing Mary to be the first, that allowed Mary to be the first to tell the apostles, because she goes back and Jesus is with them.
See, some of the responses, I think that just grasping for an answer.
Well, they're trying to find an answer.
Those kind of responses, because
Yeah.
if that's what it was, he could have turned and said, Mary, go and tell everybody that I'm here.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
wait for you.
Could be. Anyway, she goes and tells the disciples, and who were mourning and crying, and she tells them that she's seen the risen Lord and what all that he said, and they don't believe her. Again, that goes back to what we said earlier. Women's word wasn't taken for anything. And that would seem to be the 11 minus Peter, minus John, I would suggest even minus Thomas at that particular stage. So Jesus next appeared to, at least in John's account, to all the disciples. And John records this took place on the evening of that day. So it's now evening. And while they were having, it's like us having this conversation here, and then, pow, there's Jesus. Appears right in their midst. And he says, very Jesus way of saying things, peace to you. Again, we can see further evidence that Jesus' body has been changed. We've mentioned that several times. He appears in a locked room. And we see him going instantly as well from one area to another, basically without having to walk. He just shows up in there. That Bible study note said, the fact that the disciples locked the doors is a perfectly understandable reaction to the events of the past few days. But what's the significance of the inclusion of this statement by the author? It's often taken to mean that Jesus, when he entered the room, passed through the closed doors. This may well be the case, but it may be assuming too much about our knowledge of the mode in which the resurrected body of Jesus exists. The text does not explicitly state how Jesus got through the closed doors. It's possible to assume that the doors opened of their own accord before him, or that he simply appeared in the middle of the room without passing through the doors at all. The point the author makes here is simply that the closed doors were no obstacle at all to the resurrected Jesus. So we don't know how this all happened. It's just he's there. It seemed to shock them as well, but he's there. Because it startled the group. Some thought they were seeing a spirit. We would say probably at this stage, a ghost. Although the idea here is not a ghost in the Western sense, but that they were really seeing Jesus, although only his spirit without a body, which was not proof that he had necessarily risen from the dead. So, but it really was him. And that's when he shows him his hands, probably wrists is probably where it was, and the feet and his side. So I guess he pulled up to show him the gash. Tom Wright says the whole point of the story is that it's the same Jesus. The marks of the nails in his hand, the wound in his side, big enough to get your hand into. By the way, I don't think there's scars. I know we've got hymns about the scars of Jesus. I don't think there's any scars. It did not have time to heal. So, yeah, they are wounds. This isn't a ghost, nor is it someone else pretending to be Jesus. Think about it. You couldn't pretend those things. This is him. This is the body that the grave cloths could not contain any longer. But he had not only escaped death, the grave, the cloths, the spices. He comes and goes as though he belongs both in our world and in a different world, one which intersects with ours at various points, but doesn't use the same geography. Yeah, that's the reason I use my phrase. Yeah, I like the way Tom Wright put it there. If you're familiar with the writing of Stephen King and Peter Straub, they did a book back in the early 80s together that's written on two levels. And you can pass from one level to the other and then get somewhere a lot faster and come back. And so, yeah, that sort of makes some sense to me having read that. I'm trying to remember what that book's called. It's a really good book. Only read it the once.
Popping in it.
Yeah, no, but it's a superb book. If you like Stephen King, absolutely, and Peter Straub's writing, both horror, but it's a superb book. Anyway, there's no indication as mentioned that there were scars, but the fresh wounds from the nails being pulled out of his body. And they rejoiced in seeing him. Luke records, just to prove he was real, he asked if they had anything to eat. And he was given a piece of broiled fish, which he took and ate in front of them. By the way, does he need to eat? I don't think so, but he's able to eat. Interesting sort of concept there. I like that. Jesus then said to them again, peace to you. How many times has he said that in the upper room?
It's a funny entry because they're scared of living daylights at the whole lot of them.
Yeah. Come on, calm down. I think that's why he's doing. Yeah. Shalom. Shalom. Yeah. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. They had a mission now to accomplish for Jesus. He then breathed. The Greek manuscripts doesn't say he breathed on them. It says he breathed. Okay? And said, receive the Holy Spirit. The sins of the people you forgive have been forgiven. The sins you retain have been retained. By the way, you notice, not retained because of what they said. It's just that it's already been done. It's already been done. McGarvey writes, symbolic of the baptism which they were to receive at Pentecost, he breathes on them, having thus symbolically qualified them, he commissions them to forgive or retain sin. For this was the subject matter of the New Testament. This is the rest. They're going to preach the gospel. They're going to preach the good news of Jesus about sins being removed. That's the point. They didn't receive the Spirit at that moment. They're going to do that. That's going to happen on Pentecost, where he comes and lives in them and gives them the powers that they had. But he would, and Jesus says he would also give them more details about what they were to do later. And we see some of that in some of the other writings. We have the part we call the Great Commission and all that, where he talks a little bit about that. But at this stage, he simply spoke of the procedure and the power that they're going to be given. The ability to forgive or retain sins was not something they could arbitrarily decide. Jesus was, I think, referring to the forgiveness that they'd be preaching about, they'd be teaching about. Those who accepted the message would be forgiven because they would obey that message. And those who rejected their teaching would not be forgiven because they're rejecting the message of Jesus. Tom Wright says the result is that peace, twice repeated here, which Jesus had promised in 1427 and 1633. With that peace, they are enabled to perform the extraordinary task we began with, verse 23. They are pronounced in God's name and by his Spirit the message of forgiveness to all who believe in Jesus. They are also to retain sins, to warn the world that sin is a serious, deadly disease, and that to remain in it will bring death. They are to rebuke and warn, not because they don't like people or because they're seeking power or prestige for themselves, but because this is God's message to a muddled, confused, and still rebellious world. Again, I think Tom Wright got that right, of all things. But yeah, you like that. That's what that's about. Now, we know Thomas is not there. Don't know where he was, but he wasn't there. And when the other disciples told him that they'd seen the Lord, refuses to believe it. He said unless he saw the nail prints and placed his fingers in them and put his hand into the side, he would not believe. A tendency is to come down hard on Thomas and his unbelief, and we refer to him often as doubting Thomas. Need to remember it took a lot to convince the other men as well. When Mary tells them they don't believe her, then why should Thomas believe just because they said it? So they're all in the same category. 8 days later, which would take a Jewish reckoning to the next Sunday, the next first day of the week, disciples again together. This time, Thomas is with them. Don't know why it seems to be a wait of a week before he appears again. Possibly to give some time to reflect on what's happened. I don't know. Some have suggested that he chose 2 first day of the week appearances to impress on them the importance of that day. That's possible, as it was going to replace Saturday, the Shabbat, as the time to worship God. Could be as well, because Passover wasn't just a one-day event. They had the whole Feast of Unleavened Bread, that a whole week of celebration. That may be something to do with why you have I don't know. But it doesn't tell us, is the bottom line. So, sorry. There we go. So once again, even though the doors were shut and locked, Jesus appeared to them. And he said, "Peace be with you." That seems to be the trademark now. Peace. He then turned to Thomas and told him to place his finger in his hands and his hand in his side. Now, if you were Thomas, and he said that, and suddenly Jesus is repeating it back to him, I like the expression of this guy's face. That would have been the expression, I think, how does he know that? How does he know that? Then he says, "Do not continue in your unbelief, but believe." Notice the problem is not doubting. The problem is he didn't believe. By the way, the NIV puts doubt there. It shouldn't really be in the text. Greek text is unbelief. Doubt says, "I cannot believe, there are too many problems." Unbelief says, "I will not believe unless you give me the evidence that I ask for." So I think there's a difference between the two words. In fact, Wiersbe said, in fact, in the Greek text, there's a double negative. "I positively will not believe." Just whomp, whomp, whomp. Yeah. Unless he has evidence, because he's asking for evidence, is what he's doing there. Okay, for some reason, this is pausing. There's no indication that Thomas actually put his finger and hands in Jesus' wounds. I suspect he doesn't need to. He's got the evidence in front of him. Thomas' reply is, "My Lord, my Master, and my God." I wonder if Jesus reminding him of his conversation with the others was also a help in provoking his belief. And we see that obviously Jesus also heard that discussion, was aware of that discussion that went on there. But Garvey says, "We have here the first confession of Christ as God. It should be said in Thomas' favor that if his doubts were heaviest, his confession of faith was fullest. He had more doubts as to the resurrection because it meant more to him. It meant that Jesus was none other than God himself." I thought that was good. Net Bible Study Notes said, "Now the climax is reached with the proclamation by Thomas, 'My Lord and my God,' and the reader has come full circle from 1:1, where the author had introduced him to Jesus, to who Jesus was, to 20:28, where the last of the disciples has come to the full realization of who Jesus was. What Jesus had predicted in John 8:28 had come to pass. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. And they say in Greek it's I am. Then you will know that I am. By being lifted up in crucifixion, which led in turn to his death, resurrection, and exaltation with the Father, Jesus has revealed his true identity as both Lord, Kyrios, used by the Septuagint to translate Yahweh, and God, Theos, used by Septuagint to translate Elohim. So interesting, two terms used of God the Father in the Old Testament are now applied to Jesus. My Lord and my God, Kyrios and Theos. Thomas Hale says, none of the disciples had ever called Jesus God before. Thomas had been the last of the disciples to believe, but he was the first to realize that Jesus was more than the Lord, more than the Messiah. He was Almighty God himself. He was God.
John, I've got a wee note just on the side of my Bible there saying that literally it means the Lord of me and the God of me.
Yeah, yeah. It's mine, yeah. He's submitting, by the way, and we see that there in the text. Jesus said that as great as it was that Thomas now believed, he says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And John then says this is why he'd written his account of Jesus' life, to bring people to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and as God, as deity. He says Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And John wrote, and we saw this at the very beginning when we started a year back, that he wrote, Jesus did many other disciples that he had not recorded. He has a point. He has a purpose. Up to this point, he's recorded 7-ish. And I don't say 7-ish because you've got a few others that you can classify there as well. And he's not counting the resurrection, by the way. Some might consider the incident, by the way, in the next chapter, a sign as well. But John had recorded these that the reader might believe that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing all might have life in his name. Tom Wright says, and as the rest of chapter 1 after the prologue have as their central theme the surprising discovery that the Messiah, the Son of God, is none other than Jesus of Nazareth. So John concludes this chapter by insisting that out of the great mass of material he could have selected, he's chosen these signs so that we, his readers, may come to that faith for ourselves. Evidence. Thomas wanted evidence. John says, I'm giving you the evidence so that you can believe. By the way, this includes both those who are Christians and those who are not Christians, so that we can believe. Net Bible Study Note says, in light of all this evidence, it seems best to say that the author wrote with a dual purpose. One, to witness to unbelievers concerning Jesus in order that they come to believe in him and have eternal life. And two, to strengthen the faith of believers by deepening and expanding their understanding of who Jesus is. So to summarize what's in there, when Mary Magdalene discovered Jesus' body missing, she immediately went to find Peter and John, who also came and left. We see faith beginning to grow in the resurrected Christ, the resurrected Messiah. Mary was the first to see Jesus back from the dead, but Jesus then appeared to the 10 apostles that evening. Luke records there are other people there, by the way, as well. And that he's already appeared to Peter, and the 2 on the road to Emmaus were there. So there's actually more than just the 10. And that he again showed his hands, feet, and side as proof that it's him. Thomas wasn't there, refused to believe until he saw the proof himself. And Jesus appeared a week later with Thomas present. And we find one of those great confessions as to who Jesus was. My Lord and my God. Then John says his purpose in writing was that people would believe that Jesus was the Messiah, God's Son, and that they would have life in his name. So that's what summarizes chapter 20. End with this quote, Merrill Tenney, thus belief in a risen Christ made a mourner into a missionary, talk about Mary, of course, a penitent into a preacher, we got Peter, the bereaved friend into an apostle of love, John, a time and shrinking coterie of disciples into the fearless heralds of a new movement, and a doubter into a confessor. With the confession of Thomas, John reached the high peak of belief. Faith can rise no higher than when it avows Jesus of Nazareth to be its Lord and God. Already at this stage, we're seeing changed lives because of the resurrection. Questions, comments, observations, and then lunch.
Got a few. When he mentions peace be with you as the Father sent me, so even I am sending you, that's like a throwback to what he was saying about sending the helper, but at that point he hadn't mentioned that it was them that he was sending with the Holy Spirit. It was that I'm going to send the Holy Spirit. I thought that was interesting.
You get the Holy Spirit, and now once you have him, you get to go. Yeah, it's good.
That phrase he says after that, if you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven. If you withhold, they're withheld. That's very much a kingdom thing. That's the binding and loosing, keys in the house of David sort of thing. So again, that he's establishing his kingdom.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. Another thing I noticed the other day, so after the last study weekend, because there was so much tension built up with those chapters, I had to keep reading. When his death and resurrection are bookended by two scenes in gardens where he says to them, whom do you seek? So with the people coming to arrest him, they're not looking for Jesus, for who Jesus is. They're looking for the one they're going to arrest and put to death. Mary's looking for Jesus, but not Jesus. She's looking for a dead body. But both times it's garden scenes where he says to them, who are you looking for, essentially.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is a maybe sort of mirroring the garden scene in Genesis, where it's God saying to the man, where are you? So God was seeking the man there, but here it's the people seeking him. I don't know if there's something tied up there.
We're sharing you a lesson on that.
It's neat.
Point 1, point 2, point 3. There you go. 3 points of lesson. Yeah, that works.
Just thought that was some a new point. I don't think we should refer to him as doubting Thomas.
I don't either.
It should be doubting
Saint
Didymus.
Thomas.
What's that?
Doubting Didymus.
Oh, his real name. Yes, Didymus. So,
Is Thomas like an anglicized form?
no. It is one of his names, but he was also known as Didymus. He's a twin. He's a twin. Yeah.
I like Thomas for the point of view, not the doubter thing that is an obvious thing, but Thomas I think represents us in the wider scope of things.
Yeah.
The doubter. And the one thing he needs is Jesus to be there to be convinced and allowing Jesus into your life. I think that's us. I think that would be the natural reaction, because there's nothing really. He's probably watched Jesus perform miracles, but the point is, it was Jesus that performed the miracles. The miracle worker is now dead. How's the miracle worker going to raise the miracle worker? That's quite
Well, that'd be difficult to comprehend, wouldn't it?
Aye, so
Yeah. But again, of course, we know chapter 1 because John's introduced him as the creator.
Aye.
So, but they're not there. They're getting there. They're getting there. So,
Was
yeah.
there no Thomas that, when Jesus was going back to the
Thank you. Yes. Go ahead.
If we must go with him, let us die with him.
Yeah. Remember chapter 11. The beginning of chapter 11. He wants to go back to Judea. They've just left because things are getting hot. And basically they can't talk him out of it. And Thomas says, well, if he's going to go die, let's go die with him. That does not sound like a doubter to me. That's somebody who is willing to do what needs to be done, but he wants evidence. And I must admit, Alec, I'm with you. I relate to him because I like evidence. I want to see the evidence. So.
I always thought you were sarcastic. Well, let's go die with them then. Sort of thing.
Well, it's the same as Peter. You know what I mean? It's the idea of what we think and what we act like are two different
Yeah.
things. Peter experiences that, but he denies them, even though he knows that's there. He still thinks,
The gung-ho-ness.
I'll whack off
Yeah.
Marcus' ear and die
Yeah.
with you, Lord.
Yeah.
When it comes
It's all there. Yeah. Excellent. It's lunchtime. Billy, you want to express thanks for the food that we have, and then we'll take a break, and at some point I'll start again. So.
Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this